Well, let's get started. Welcome, officially welcome, everyone. My name is Rabbi Hilly Haber. I am the Director of Social Justice Organizing and Education at Central Synagogue. And it is my absolute honor tonight to be joined by Nigel Farina, Jarrell Daniels, and John Ducksworth on this Zoom call. We have a wonderful conversation that will bring us to, I think, in honor, we're moving toward Shavuot, a holiday where we celebrate revelation. And that moment we received Torah at Mount Sinai. And when I think of Torah and I think of the history of commentary and kind of the ways that we as a Jewish people engage with Torah, our most sacred teachings, think about a page of Talmud. We engage with it as this conversation, this dynamic conversation where all opinions are recorded and valued. There isn't necessarily in Talmud, we may have a right or wrong, but we have full conversations. There's a value placed on preserving everyone's opinion and sharpening one another's opinions through disagreement, through productive disagreement. And I am so excited because in that spirit of Torah and of learning, we have a conversation tonight in which we will have the opportunity to sharpen our own thinking about the criminal legal system and the ways we think about prosecution. We are joined by two people who are on the front lines of the criminal legal system in New York, and they will share with us their experiences and their work together and the incredible partnership that they have built. So it is such an honor to be joined by you both tonight. I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm so excited to dream with you, to think with you, and really to hear your stories. So I'm just gonna no more delaying this. We're so honored to have you. Thank you both for joining us, and please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for having us, and thank the Central Synagogue for organizing this type of event. And it's unique in the sense that it's bringing people who the world would believe it has the most opposing views about society and definitely about criminal justice in this country. And I'm excited about the conversation. I'm looking forward to it. But really, I think it's important that I just, kind of frame it all before we dive into the conversation by giving some context around my background and how I got where I am today. And I'll begin by saying, I'm someone who unfortunately experienced the worst of system failures in New York City. I was, growing up, I had contact with the Administration of Child Services during my time in foster care placement. But I think the darkest part of my journey is that I was exposed to violence at an early age. And the first instance of violence that I was around was when my mother's best friend had a throat slit in front of me and my sister when I was 5 years old. And immediately after that, we moved into a neighborhood that wasn't the best, and we were surrounded by violent crime, and in the neighborhood infested by crime and poverty. Even inside the household, my mother suffered from years of domestic abuse. So I say all this to say that my upbringing kind of conditioned me to respond and react by going to the extreme, by acting aggressive and responding with violence in situations. And this is ultimately what brought me before Nigel in the courtroom many years ago in 2012. But I think that if I can backtrack, I think when we think along the lines of the criminal justice system, we oftentimes don't get to hear those parts of people's journey. We only hear about the docket number, the case file, and the circumstances around an individual incident that took place. And oftentimes that's usually the only information that a prosecutor or prosecutor's office in general usually uses in their defense or in their justification for why a person is quote unquote belongs in jail. And I think that we're here today to post something different and to think along the lines of progressive prosecution. Just taking this even step further, most of the world would never expect for me and Nigel to be in this space, for us to be comfortable having a conversation, for us to, want to work and collaborate across our own differences and perspectives and opinions. But I think that this is a symbol of hope for what the future holds for our society. And I think that far too often society has failed to push people to have these challenging conversations with each other, and it's pushed and unfortunately it's led to systems continuing to fail people because we aren't afraid to step outside of our comfort zone. And I think that that's how I want to open up the conversation. Nigel, I want to pass it over to you to just, if you can just tell us about your journey and how we got to know you.
No, I appreciate that, Jarrell. And first of all, before I go into that, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge you, Jarrell, and the space that you just framed for us. I want to thank Rabbi Haber for inviting me into this conversation. It's great to see you again. It's great to see Jarrell again. It's always great to see you, John. I really appreciate giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and reflections with your congregation. Just listening to Jarrell, it should be obvious to all of you why I was anxious to want to partner up with this young man. He's brilliant. He is a passionate and eloquent advocate for the criminal justice reform that he is petitioning for. And it's just a pleasure to work with him and his energy every time we do. But Jarrell and I are under no illusions that this journey is going to be easy, because the path isn't always clear. Changing hearts and minds is a difficult struggle, even on the best of days. And, you know, this is going to be a process. And I know that when we were chatting earlier, Rabbi, you asked me a little bit about my journey. And Jarrell mentioned how our paths first intersected. Just to frame it in this greater context, so you understand why this journey is as challenging as it is, I just want to take a moment and step back and tell you how Jarrell and I met from my perspective, because I think it offers some context for the challenge and this great hill that we have to overcome. So back in 2011, this city was experiencing a serious spike in violent crime. Shootings were up. The mayor and the police commissioner at the time believed that that violence was being drug-driven by gang activity. There were 4 or 5 shootings almost every weekend in Brooklyn and in the Bronx. There were violent robberies that were taking place in broad daylight. And something new was happening also with the violence on the subways. There was a lot of slashings that people thought were linked to gang initiation. Some of you may remember 2011, but unfortunately, we don't really have to, because we're experiencing that same kind of uptick in gang violence right now today, sadly enough. And so some of my colleagues in the Bronx reached out to me and said, hey, Nigel, do you want to team up with my unit and your unit and see if we could do something to stem this tide of violence? And so we began imagining a project that would ultimately become, as the newspapers would call it, Operation Crew Cut, because in New York City, the gangs were named crews. And so that's what the papers called it. And we worked on this project. And in many ways, it was fashioned in a similar model to what the federal prosecutors did in the late 80s when they took down the mafia using RICO laws. We used state conspiracy laws. And the idea was we wouldn't just prosecute one individual shooting or one gang assault or one robbery. We try to pull up this gang problem from its roots by bringing group, mass, multi-defendant conspiracy cases. And that's what I did. And it was successful for a time. I mean, if it was a permanent solution, we wouldn't be in this conundrum today now, would we? But that's what we did. And we brought multiple cases in the Bronx. Dub City, 280 gang crew, 6 Wild, and another gang by the name of WTG, Walter Township Gang. We also brought that prosecution in 2012. There were 12 young men, very young, African-American and Latino men that were part of that indictment. And that indictment laid out some serious crimes: attempted murder, violent shootings, gang assaults, gun possession, drug distribution. One of the young men in that indictment was named Jarrell Daniels. And he was charged with very serious crimes. It was alleged that he shot another young man, shot at him 3 times, hit him twice, once in the chest and once in the leg. When Jarrell Daniels was brought to court, given the seriousness of the charges, it was recommending a serious amount of jail time, 6 years. And I made it clear to his lawyer at the time that had we recovered the gun in that case and the evidence of a strong case was even stronger, it might be more time. I made it clear that had that bullet landed in that young man's chest a little bit to the left, and this was a murder case and not an attempted murder case, we might not be having this conversation at all. I say that I offered Jarrell Daniels 6 years. That's not quite true, because I never really spoke to Jarrell Daniels back then, which is shocking to me because I speak to him all the time now. He's my friend. But I never spoke to him back then because that's not the way our court system works. I spoke to his lawyer and I extended the offer to him, and I'm ashamed, almost embarrassed to say, I barely looked at Jarrell Daniels in that courtroom. He was just one shackled, young African-American man in a parade of young, shackled African-American men that was shuffled into the courtroom in chains, arraigned in 10 minutes, short court appearances that were even shorter than that afterwards, and then they were shuffled out. When I offered Jarrell 6 years, I was seeking justice, because that's what I do. I'm a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office, assigned to the Office of Special Narcotics. And so Jarrell Daniels spent 6 years in prison because I thought that was justice. A serious crime had been committed, and I wanted accountability. And accountability, in my mind at that time, came in the form of a prison cell. But Jarrell Daniels doesn't belong in a prison cell. Jarrell Daniels is a brilliant young man who's going to change the world one day. Jarrell Daniels belongs at Columbia, where he's an honor student. Jarrell Daniels belongs eventually in law school, where he's going to blow the charts off of whatever school he blesses with his presence. Jarrell Daniels is going to graduate from law school and be an elected official and serve this community and our people. Jarrell Daniels is an amazing young man, and he doesn't belong in prison. But I sent him there. And I sent him there because I wanted to pursue justice. So what was right? How could Jarrell Daniels deserve to go to prison but not belong there? Ever since I met Jarrell Daniels again, when he just mentioned at the police summit on racial disparity, I've been asking myself that question ever since. Did I do the right thing 10 years ago? Was this the right result in this case? Was this what justice looked like? Is this how I should have done it? Now, many of you might have an answer to that question, laying out the story that from both Jarrell and I, many of you may have a very clear answer in your head about what should have done and what should have I done and what I should not have done. But I can tell you quite honestly right now, that question, I haven't fully answered. But because, ironically, of my partnership with Jarrell Daniels now, I ask myself a different question. What I think is a better question, a more relevant question. Now, what I ask myself is, as a prosecutor, as a law enforcement official, 10 years ago, what should I have done to prevent Jarrell Daniels from being on that corner with that illegal gun in the first place? What, as a prosecutor, should I have done to prevent that young man from slashing Jarrell in the face that provoked him to pull out a gun and shoot him in his defense? What, as a prosecutor, should I be doing today to reduce crime rather than just prosecute it? Because I have a lot of tools at my disposal that could prevent the next shooting, prevent the next crime, and not simply do a cleanup on aisle 6. So this is why I'm in this space. This is why I've been engaging with Jarrell Daniels, because I want to reimagine my job. I want to reimagine law enforcement. I want to have a hand in preventing the next shooting, not just simply prosecuting the next shooter and witnessing the victims and all the aftermath in its wake. So that's where I am, and that was what the birth of Project Restoration. And I want to turn it back over to Jarrell so he could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nigel. And I just want to start by saying that when we met in the courtroom, you did everything that you were trained to do. And I think that that's the most important part of this whole conversation, is that we're taught as lawyers, as me as an aspiring lawyer myself, but we're taught to live within the binary frame of law and order. So when a person commits an offense, the way that society is structured, the only way that we've been holding them accountable before there was a such thing as a diversion and the alternative to incarceration was to prosecute and incarcerate. So again, you did what you were trained to do. And I guess my comfortability is that for my multiple arrests before I committed this grave felony offense that brought me before you, every time I was arrested and appeared before a judge and a prosecutor, I assumed the worst. It didn't matter if they were white, black, green, yellow. It didn't matter. I assumed that they wanted me to go to prison, and I assumed that they wanted to obtain a conviction, whether it was a low-level misdemeanor offense, a low-level felony offense. I expected the worst every time I appeared in the courtroom because there was an instance that happened that brought me to that space, and the lawyers in that space were doing exactly what they were trained to do. So one thing that I know in my time growing up is that you have to be held accountable. My mother always taught me the values of being held accountable for the things that you do. And if you make a decision, you live out the consequences for it. The problem with society is that we don't have any other consequence for bad actions besides putting a person in prison. The problem with the court process is that there's not opportunities for people to learn about the journey of an individual. The problem is that the educational institutions that prepare people to step into legal professions, you can go through a whole undergraduate journey as a political science major and not have to grapple with race, not have to grapple with human development and understanding the environmental circumstances that influence human behavior. Because you're not psychology majors, you're not studying sociology, you're on a law track. And then when you get to the law institution itself, they're teaching you how to think along the lines in this binary frame again of how to be the best lawyer in that space, whether you go on to become a judge or you step into the role of a prosecutor or defense attorney. And I think that with these institutions in place, we're continuing to fail the justice system. So when we say criminal justice reform doesn't happen by changing the system itself. It changed by changing the institutions that lead people to come in contact with the criminal justice system. So we begin with the education system first, then we work our way back down to the social service agencies like the Administration of Child Services and Public Welfare. When we provide and invest resources in communities, then individual outcomes are changed. But the fault doesn't go to any individual representative. The fault goes to the institutions that didn't prepare us to grapple with these challenging issues, to grapple with the stories that bring people to the courtroom. And I think that, what I'm most comfortable about is that no matter what people may think about the relationships that I form with prosecutors' office, given my personal experiences, I'm someone who sees the better day and the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that we can't get to a better future until we have these kind of moments where we can collaborate across differences. It takes for us to step outside of my comfort zone. And I would say that I would attribute my comfortability to even have been reacquainted with you after my time incarcerated to the Inside Criminal Justice course in Queensboro Correctional Facility. Now, when Lucy founded this program and she brought prosecutors inside of a state prison, she won't say it, but I'll say it for her. This was historic. This never happened in American history where prosecutors entered a state prison to work with the incarcerated population over a semester-long period and allow those incarcerated men to inform policy recommendations for a government agency, let alone the prosecutor's office while we're incarcerated. And I think that me being in that space prepared me for the moment that I reconnected with you. And when I met you again at the Open Society Racial Disparities and Policing Summit in 2018, I had already been prepared because of the Inside Criminal Justice course to have a conversation with a prosecutor. I'd already been prepared to talk about criminal justice reform and to explain the complications with policies like Operation Crew Cut. I think that when we use these learning opportunities, we'll have a better outcome. And I think that a large portion of the malfunctions of the criminal justice system happen solely because people are just uninformed on how they can best practice as a lawyer. And I think if we move a step further than that, there's much more than what people think is presented in the docket file. My greatest suggestion is that we incorporate social workers in the court process.
Mm.
If there was an opportunity for biopsychosocial in-depth ones to be conducted throughout the court proceedings, most cases last over a year. If that social worker was able to build a relationship with the client, I won't call him a defendant or anything out of his name, but with the client, and that client is able to explain their journey, then we'll be in a position where the prosecutor is given an alternative to the case file or the charge that they're presented with. But unfortunately, the system isn't set up in that way. And then we can have conversations around that. But I think what I'm most proud about in the relationship that we formed since reconvening, re-meeting in 2018 is your willingness to step outside of your own comfort zone. And you work within the Office of Special Narcotics under a senior leadership that has been in place for a while, that has its own ideology of how to deliver justice. And I think that for you, your willingness to step outside your comfort zone and join a program that I helped to found when I came home, it shows that you were willing to do something different. But one of the things I think is most important for me to flag in this conversation is that it's not about me. It's not about the opportunities that I was given to change my life. It's not about the position that I'm in today. It's about the possibility of us creating other versions of me in this world if we would continue to think outside of the box. It's not enough for me to be the only Jarrell Dames that has this story of coming home from prison and being able to attend an Ivy League institution, being able to develop programs. Everyone, if we know anything about human development, anyone has the potential to be great. It's just how do we unlock and maximize that potential that we see in young people in today's society? How do we move past the stigmatizing images that are associated that the media constantly portrays of Black and brown youth? And how do we think outside of the box of a legal sector so that we can ensure that we're using all of the tools and resources? And I'll steal your own analogy, Nigel. How do we get people to see that they have more than just a hammer and a set of nails? How do we get them to see that there's other ways for us to think about delivering justice that are not within the binary frame of law and order? So I think,
Well,
I'll pause there, but I really think that, we got a long way to go, but you and I are planting the seed for it to grow and be watered.
Jarrell, man, first of all, I appreciate you, brother, and I appreciate all that you just said. So much of what you just shared with us resonates with me. I don't even know where to begin. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in the Justice Ambassadors program. That literally changed the way I practice law, literally changed my life. That experience was transformative, and I carry with it so many fond memories, but so many important lessons. Something else that you said with me resonated when you said how you can step back from your own perilous, treacherous journey and say, I understand, Nigel, when you were standing in your courtroom, what you were doing, you were just doing your job. I'll tell you that resonates with me, and I'll tell you why. If you'll permit me, Gerard, I'd just like to share a brief story that could put that into some sharp relief. A few years ago, myself and the Manhattan DA, Cy Vance, went up to Washington Heights to speak at a block association. And the theme was to see if we can do what we could to help the community combat gang violence. And after I delivered my remarks, some people in the audience were gathering around afterwards, asking some questions and just offering some commentary. And I just watched this one young man standing in the background, just waiting patiently for his chance to speak to me. And when he did, he introduced himself. I'll just share his first name. His name is Angel and he said to me, "Hey, how you doing, Mr. Farina? I just got out of prison. I'm a gang member, former gang member. I'm a Latin king. But while I was in prison, I found God and I've changed my life. And I just want to share the blessings and the new philosophy that I have on life with other people. And I just want to help other young Black and Latino men not go down the path that I did. And so I was wondering how I might help. And I said, wow, Angel, that's fantastic, brother. That's terrific. You definitely can help. You definitely can reach a lot of the young people that I can't reach. And your story is inspirational, brother. And I'm glad that you're in this space now. So you know what? I'm here in Washington Heights at this block association, but in a few weeks, I'm going to be going down to Harlem to speak to a similar group of parents and concerned citizens. Brother, would you like to come with me? And his eyes lit up and he said, yeah. He was excited. He was a little nervous, but he was excited and he was determined to do it. So I gave him my business card and we exchanged pleasantries and he started to walk away. And so did I. And then he stopped and turned back and he said, hey, Mr. Farina, Mr. Farina. And I said, yeah, Angel, what's up? And he goes, you know, I know why I want to do this. You know, I found the Lord and it's changed my life. And I want to save other people's lives. And I want to keep other young Black and brown men and women from committing crime and from going to prison. Of course, that's what I want to do. I feel like I'm called to do that. I know why I'm here, but I'm just a little confused. Why do you want to do this, Nigel? Aren't you driving down your own business? I just want you to reflect a little bit on Angel's point because it resonated with me, just like Jarrell's comments resonate with me. I never thought that my business was putting Black and brown people in prison. I always saw my role as protecting the community and seeking justice. But as we think about it, Angel isn't wrong in what he said. What's wrong is that we as prosecutors have done such a poor job of communicating to most people that we as prosecutors, as citizens, as members of this community, as members of synagogues and churches and mosques, we have just as much of an interest as anybody else in reducing crime and keeping people out of prison. I want to go to more graduations, like I'm going to go to Jarrell's graduation. I want to go to more graduations and less sentences, just like all the rest of you do. At that same block association event, just a few, like almost like a half an hour earlier before I met Angel, Mr. Vance, District Attorney Vance, had spoke, and then he introduced me and invited me on the dais to talk to the audience a bit about how the community can recognize the signs of when their sons and daughters were getting caught up in the traps of seduced by gangs, and how they can see if they're becoming disaffected and perhaps vulnerable to the pull of gang life. And I was no more than 5 minutes into my remarks when out the corner of my eye, this woman stood up and she was holding this framed picture. And it stopped me in my tracks because to this day, I just remember the frame was so beautiful. It was this silver, beautiful frame of what I would later learn was a picture of her 14-year-old son. She was obviously crying and her voice was shivering. And she said, my son was 14 years old when gang members shooting up a block took his life. My son is a victim of gang violence. And all of us on the dais and in the audience respectfully and reverently lowered our heads and mumbled our condolences. Some in the audience muttered, "What a shame and what a tragedy this was." But I was not at all prepared for what happened next. This woman then reached slightly to her right and back and raised her arm and pointed to the back of the audience and said, "And that woman right there, her son was the one who killed my son." Well, you then could have heard a pin drop in that auditorium. And then I watched that woman that she had pointed to rise up. She too was crying. And she said, "Yes, my son is in a gang. He's only 19 years old. And he's in prison now. And he's going to be there for the rest of his life. And I'm only going to be able to see him through bars or glass. They say he killed your son. I don't know. I wasn't there. They say he killed your son. But what I know is this. My son joined this gang when he was 14 years old. He didn't want to join a gang. They forced him. He was intimidated. Where were all the rest of you when my son was 14? Tell you why that story experience stays with me. Because in that very moment, I knew we were racing against a clock. We've got a brief window of opportunity. When a 14-year-old boy or girl, just at the beginning of their life, we find is at a crossroads where their life can be taken or their life can be misdirected. And then at a point, just 5 short years later, they can make a decision that they can never pull back and take a life that they can never give back before most of us are even prepared to make any real decisions about what college we might go to or who we might take to the prom. They're making decisions that could set the path for the rest of their lives. What are we all doing in those 5 years? That's our challenge. What are we doing as the society? What are we doing as prosecutors? What are we doing as judges? What are we doing as lawyers? What are we doing to change the trajectory of that 14-year-old so he doesn't become a 19-year-old, take someone else's life and ruin 2 families and all the collateral damage in between? That's on us. And that was the birth, that was the inspiration for Project Restoration between Jarrell and I.
Mm-hmm.
Because we need to change that story. We need to interrupt 2 14-year-olds that are already dancing on my radar as a prosecutor, that are already coming across my desk because they're running to hang out with gang members who have already chosen their path, sad as that path may be. And we've got to change that trajectory because we are losing an entire generation of Black and brown young men. I used to be a young Black and brown young man. I'm still an African-American man. I'm a prosecutor, but I'm an African-American man. This is my community too. This is on us. Jarrell, I just want to thank you for giving me that moment to share that thought.
No, definitely. And that's a powerful journey. And I think, like, for the purpose of this conversation, it's important to give context around what we consider to be gangs and street crews. And I think I've tried to do a little bit of this in my advocacy work around this. I think when we use the term gang, it incites these negative connotations that the media has long since created around it. And when we think about the quote unquote term gang, we usually associate it with blood, Crip, Lion King, Patria, so on and so forth. And I think when it's used to describe teenagers who are affiliated with their neighborhood or their block and these crew associations, we give them a status that they don't really deserve and that they haven't earned and they haven't lived up to. And I think, with the process of the criminal justice system, when we send these troubled teenagers to prison and force them to grow up into adult life, they're exposed to true gang culture. And then they return back to these same neighborhoods. And now they're either blood or Crip or folk.
Yes.
And now you have the mixing of generations and neighborhoods, some who went to prison and jail, who've taken on this full-on gang culture, and now who are influencing the younger generation. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, it's really important to offer the distinction between New York street culture versus a California, for example, street culture,
Yes.
where they have true initiation processes in their gang culture. New York, I don't see it as still as that being the truth for New York City per se. And I think that what I'm really saying is that people voluntarily enroll within street organizations in New York City. Just from my culture, my experience growing up here, and my interactions with young people and the work that I've done, it isn't this force. Like those stories are one off, and those are one in a million
Right.
occasions. And I think that the majority of people, they opt into this lifestyle, and it's normally because, if I use my own personal experiences, things
Yes.
are happening in a household that are pushing people towards the law of the streets. And they're seeking comfort and stability
Yes.
and brotherhood, and to in the absence of fatherhood, and they're seeking it inside of these organizations in the street.
That's such an important point, Jarrell, and I'm so glad you made that distinction because it is the gang culture in New York City, or the crew culture, or whatever you want to call it, is very, very different from Chicago and LA. And people who say, well, violence is violence, it's a distinction without a difference. I think you have to listen to what Jarrell just said. I'm a member of an African American fraternity, which I'm very proud of and still active in, Kappa Alpha Psi. And I joined Kappa Alpha Psi when I was 18 years old because I was looking for some fellowship and support of other people that looked like me while I was at my own Ivy League school. Sorry, Drew, I couldn't get into Columbia. I went to Brown, but you'll forgive me, my brother. But I was there at a traditionally white institution where there wasn't a lot of people that looked like me, and I was looking for a surrogate family. I was looking for a support network. I was looking for a group of brothers that I can call my brothers and rely upon. And that was really, really important. And I see those underpinnings in the crews that are there. And it starts out with just this desire to find support and love and comfort, as you so eloquently put it, as when other support networks, maybe like a father, maybe school has a bet, maybe there isn't this support network that's there, and so this becomes a substitute for that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Unfortunately, when those crews go down a path and follow a path that isn't laudable, they start to intersect with the criminal justice system. But these aren't bad young men. These are young men doing occasionally bad things. And so it's on us to change that trajectory. But if, to your very point, if we've demonized them through terminology, it's much easier to lock away a gang member than it is to redirect a young man who's troubled and needs better opportunities and better avenues. So I think you make an excellent point, Jarrell, and I just wanted to just amplify that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll just to add more to it, it's like when we think about human evolution and how people develop in different environments and circumstances and based on opportunities that are afforded to them or not. When I think about a young person, putting myself back in my teenage shoes, what could have been done differently? So there's some questions in the chat. I do want to get to those too. And Ed, I will answer that. I'll say first in plain language that I don't have that exact number, but what I will say is that we can't arrest our way out of solving problems and locking up everything that is wrong when someone breaks a fence in society. And I think gangs aren't going anywhere. I'll say that one more time. Gangs aren't going anywhere. Street crews aren't going anywhere. What we have to do is repurpose them. And I've tried to do this in my work with the youth, realign them with the mission. Because as someone who's a former blood member, when I took that oath and I said, Black Liberation Organization of Defense, I was supposed to be representing a community vanguard as a member of that organization. If you ask someone who was a part of the Crips, Community Revolution, and Park Progress, they were supposed to be a community vanguard. The mission got distorted from the 1990s up until now. The values and the principles that these organizations were founded on, they haven't been passed down in the generations. And I say all this to say that repurposing these organizations can be as simple as just incentivizing them not to engage in any conflict in the community.
And Jarrell, to that point, why don't you take this moment right now in time to talk about why Project Restoration just is an opportunity to do just that, just what you just said.
Yeah, and I think, the spirit of Project Restoration really derived from our personal experiences in the courtroom. Although we didn't talk much and look at each other during that process, we both knew that something was wrong. All of my friends looked like me, were Black, grew up without a father, and for the most part, we were poor. And for you, in your job description, most of the time, the people who appeared before you looked like me, were young like me, and faced similar socioeconomic situations. And I think, as we had the opportunity to learn more about each other, we learned, number one, that we had more similarities than we had differences. We were just on two opposite sides of the courtroom. And I think that as we learned that as a way to move forward through this, is that arresting people is just not going to fix the problem. So the spirit of Project Restoration was to address this communal call to end gun violence in New York City, and specifically reduce the amount of gang conflicts in some of the hotspots in New York City. And I think, the vision we have behind Project Restoration is that before we do these mass indictments, before we lock up 100 and some odd teenagers for the most part and young adults, before we arrest 20 or so people from this neighborhood, 30 or so people from the other neighborhood who are alleged to be engaged in a rival feud, before we spend millions of dollars keeping these people detained on Rikers Island and incarcerated in state prison, before we do that and sacrifice taxpayers' dollars, we should think about what can be done as an alternative. So throughout the course of these conspiracy-based investigations, there's usually over a year that lapses before an arrest is even made. So there are crimes taking place, people are being identified for the conspiracy, there's a targeted investigation on social media. But the whole thing is that it's taking a year for an arrest to happen. What can be done during that year time to help at least one person? We're not going to say we're going to get everyone in the crew to stop their bad behavior, but what can be offered at least to one person, or at least to some people in that group, to help them think about their life differently? That doesn't involve them being arrested, being detained, and eventually being prosecuted. So Project Restoration is really an opportunity for those who are considered to be the quote unquote drivers of crime in the neighborhood to participate in a year-long restorative justice programming. And the way that we envisioned it functioning is that for the first 6 months, there will be initial restorative justice peace circles with one side of the alleged quote unquote rivalry. And then after those initial 6 months, we will bring both sides of the conflict together to reconcile the differences and hopefully reach agreeable terms that doesn't result in the continuing feud. And the importance of just a simple conversation as we're having today, Nigel, the importance of a simple conversation, we can show the young people that, number one, you've only inherited this rivalry because you moved to a neighborhood. If I asked you where did it really come from and why you were reinforcing it, you won't have an answer for me.
Right.
So how about we just cut to the chase and say that let's just cut it out now? Because you're harming people in the community. Your mother doesn't want to see you in jail, and nobody wants to see anyone hurt. And you don't want to feel safe in your own community. And that's why you believe that you need to carry an illegal weapon, as I did. So let's help everyone feel safe by just having a general conversation, using the principles of restorative justice to reconcile our differences. And the amazing part of what we hope to come out of Project Restoration is that if they successfully complete this type of programming, that they have prosecution and arrest deferred. So we're thinking beyond alternative to incarceration. We're thinking beyond diversion. We're trying to prevent young people from having another traumatic experience that they'll have to live with for the rest of their life. We're trying to prevent people from shouldering the mark of a felony conviction. Not everyone has the aspirations to go to college. So they'll be living with that felony conviction for a portion of their life. They'll be facing employment restrictions. They'll be facing housing restrictions. They'll be facing the 40,000 collateral consequences that come with a felony conviction. So I think what we aim to do with Project Restoration is to move beyond that binary frame of law and order, to not wait until a person is arrested before we offer them a chance to change their life. We want to be preventative. And I think that that's the spirit and essence of Project Restoration.
That's absolutely right, Jarrell. And that is exactly the spirit of Project Restoration. And what and so obviously, as you just identified, what makes the program so unique is this is a pre-arrest intervention opportunity, not a diversion, but a redirection before it gets that far. And what, from a law enforcement side, what allows us to facilitate that opportunity is, as you said, through my investigations, those conspiracy cases that mirrored those RICO cases that went after the mafia, as if these crews were on that level. Our research that went into that, as Jarrell just said, took years. And we had so many individuals that were targets of our investigation, a vast amount of which we never even prosecuted, but we gathered information on and intelligence on, and we put that information in a file. And it wasn't our problem because it wasn't our case. What a missed opportunity that was. So we have an opportunity there to encourage law enforcement, the police department and the DA's offices, to partner with the community at this other juncture, this pre-arrest juncture. How about all this information that we gathered ostensibly for a good purpose, but we know this particular young man, he's on a bad path. He's doing bad things. He's not a bad kid. And so because his activities aren't serious enough to warrant prosecution, we just file him away. He's not our problem. Well, how about making him our problem? How about saying, you know what, we're going to engage with this person, not through an arrest, but as Jarrell said, through restorative justice, through an opportunity and through a program to change his trajectory pre-arrest. And this is an opportunity for the community to see another side of law enforcement, to see the police in a different way, not always offering the stick, but just coming in with some carrots, coming in and saying, hey, listen, I know what you're really seeking. You're seeking a sense of support, a sense of belonging. We can give this to you in a more constructive way. And this is an opportunity to have law enforcement tap into the information and research that they're already doing, but just redirecting it in what I consider to be ultimately a more productive way for society and for our community. And that's what gets me so excited about Project Restoration, and why every time I dialogue with Jarrell about it, it just gets me more excited. And so our challenge is, as we walk around and we present this to the different district attorneys' offices, I understand that there are legal challenges, which I won't bore you with, of sharing confidential information and so forth. I'm not going to pretend to you that this is a simple fix. It isn't. And we've got to get some of the bugs out. But this is too important to allow the logistics to get in the way. This is too important. Like I said before, we are losing an entire generation of young Black and brown young men, and we have a chance to do something about it. We got to take that chance.
Yeah. And there's another question in the chat that we didn't get to answer. Is posed by an anonymous attendee, so I'm not sure your name. But the question was if they were wondering if did we think anything can be done, just let alone if criminal justice reform efforts and policy reform is enough to quote unquote fix the criminal justice system. And there was comments around prison abolition and police abolition. So I say my response to that is I never tell people, you know, we're going to fix the criminal justice system from within or working around it. My suggestion and the best way that I think to go about, you know, closing down jails and to working to make the police not as an active force in communities is to literally improve educational experiences for people growing up. Imagine if we reshape the Department of Education to include educational courses on financial literacy, on conflict management and de-escalation, the importance of effective communication. If we incorporated true aspects of restorative justice in the academic rigors of the K through 12 educational experiences of people, then school would be more engaging at that point. If I'm learning about skills and concepts that I can literally apply to my life right now, then we wouldn't have a dropout rate so high in the underfunded, under-resourced neighborhoods. If young people could be learning about financial literacy or entrepreneurship while they're in high school, then high school will be that much more engaging. The math class that I often skip because I'm not using these numbers in that way, I would more than likely go if these other opportunities existed. I think that oftentimes we think within just the criminal justice lens as a way to make the change can happen from the outside. I think that when you have mentorship opportunities, when you have employment opportunities, when you have other kind of opportunities that keep people away from the criminal justice system, then that's a way to close jails and prisons. That's a way to make the police not have to continue to spend tours circling the neighborhood because there's a constant crime presence there. And I think
And,
that the longer we keep people engaged is really how we're going to keep people out of the system.
and can
I
I
want
add
to,
one thing?
oh,
Oh, I'm sorry, just one thing, real quick point. And Jarrell, to that point, I just want to make it clear that I just came back from a session at the Manhattan DA's office put forth where there was 203 attendees listening to how we can reimagine criminal justice, how we can engage in our community in a respectful dialogue around issues of race and understanding about how we can introduce accountability in different ways. I mean, it was a dynamic conversation that reminds me that there are so many prosecutors, so many police officers who want to be in this space in a constructive, productive way. We don't have to be at odds. We were at you and I were on opposite sides of the courtroom, but we don't have to be on the opposite sides of this issue, as I think we've tried to point out. And I just want to make that clear that there are so many good actors in law enforcement who want to engage constructively and positively in this space to get better outcomes. My apologies, Rabbi. I just wanted to just throw that in.
no, Nigel, my apologies. Thank you so much for adding that. This conversation is so riveting, and I want to kind of bring up what you kind of are talking about is really the embodiment of this amazing ritual that comes out of the text of Deuteronomy and also the Talmud. And I just want to bring it up because there's such a kind of theological import to what you're saying, and I want to ask too, as I'm moving there, and of what the role of faith communities can be in restorative justice, in helping you and supporting your work. But just kind of to just bring in this moment of text that kind of embodies what you're talking about.
Please.
In Deuteronomy, we read about a corpse that's found kind of between two different towns, and nobody kind of knows the circumstances of the murder. Nobody knows what happened. And the town leaders engage in this ritual where they kind of absolve themselves of this death. And they say, our hands didn't commit this, our eyes didn't see it, we didn't do this, we're not guilty. And our commentators, our sages, kind of write about this, and they offer different reasons for the words of the officials. You know, what exactly are they not guilty of is the question. And one of the comments is, well, we're not guilty that we let someone go who we knew was violent, right? We didn't let someone go who's a murderer. We prosecuted them, I think I would say. We put them in jail. But then there's something else, which is that we didn't let someone go hungry in this town. That's what we're guilty of. Could this have been a person who was hungry, who wasn't cared for, who felt that they had no other recourse
Yes.
but to kill someone?
Yes.
You know, that this was an act of violence that was born of poverty, of necessity, of tragedy.
Yes.
And we have this conversation that is so live in our Jewish tradition as we are
Mm.
committed to pursue justice. And I think what you two have kind of done for us tonight so beautifully is kind of break open, you know, we in Central and EMI New York are involved in kind of criminal justice reform and policy and conversations, but you know, it's such a polarized conversation in space right now, and it is so amazing to hear you both talk because, you know, this needn't be a polarizing conversation. This can be a conversation about healing and reform, and that we sharpen together we work together to sharpen our own perspectives and our actions and to bring more justice to more people and to create thriving communities. And so I have John Duxworth is here with us tonight too. He's the director of EMI New York at Central Synagogue, and he and I together, kind of with Rabbi Nicole Auerbach, asking these questions in faith communities of how can we support your work? How can we, using the tools of theological imagination in our communities, how can we support what you're doing? How can we expand this dialogue? How can we, bring work with you to create more justice for more people?
I would love to get John's thoughts on that.
Well, Nigel, quite frankly, that's the question that I have for you. I mean, my answer to it is that's why I do the work that I do. That's the role of the church and people of faith. But as a DA, as a person engaged in what you do, as a colleague to Jarrell, what do you, and I ask both of you this question, reiterating what the rabbi just said, where do you see the church, people of faith, multi-faith, entering this engagement, entering this conversation? How can we be most effective?
Yeah, I mean, I coming from the African American community, coming from a family of faith, and growing up in my church, I've always looked to the church and its leaders for guidance and spiritual inspiration. I think that we see, whether we're talking about the civil rights movement, whether we're talking about what's going on right now with criminal justice reform, we know that faith and religion is such an important lodestar for us to guide us in understanding and giving us context. Because for me, what this always was about is about morality. It's always about finding this place where as I'm pursuing justice, how could it be that 10 years ago, I was earnestly pursuing justice, and now I look at it and justice seems to be defined differently now. And the only thing that I can explain as an answer is that my moral compass has just somehow gotten slightly shifted. And I can't help but think that that isn't the presence of faith and God and spirituality in helping me understand that, this community is bigger than me. And if I want to be a better prosecutor, if I want to seek justice, which is my mission, I have to do it within that greater context, with that greater understanding, with compassion, with understanding, these things that my faith teaches me and inspires me. And so I look to people like you, John, like you, Rabbi, to help me sharpen my faith and my understanding in keeping that North Star where it is in my life, because I will always be committed. I'm a career prosecutor. I will always be committed to pursuing justice, but I'm also prepared to embrace the idea that pursuing justice is an evolving process and may look differently as I get further guidance from my conscience, from my God, and from people that can guide me. And so I think that spiritual leaders have an important place in helping shape restorative justice. And that's why I initially reached out to both you and the rabbi to help me figure out how we can redirect these young men in a meaningful way, since you've been a fisherman of souls, a savior of souls as a vocation, and you know how to do it better than all of us. So that's how I envision this partnership going.
Thank you for that, Nigel. And the good news is we're able to keep this conversation going after this webinar ends. But Jarrell, if you would, where do you see the church? How do you see the church? People, I don't want to say the church. I want to say people of faith. How do you see people of faith speaking to this issue, addressing this issue, helping to change it?
Yeah, John, I'm over here beaming with excitement, ready to dive into this question. I can't hold it back. I love questions like this because I actually like really suggesting things that people can do in this arena, and like I can be as what's the right word for this? as extravagant as I would like given it.
Be short and be direct, though. How's
Yeah,
that?
I will. I will. So I would say, there's three concrete things that I think that the church can do. And one of the things I especially want to highlight is the power of religious organizations as an advocacy coalition, as an advocacy organization. I think that opening the church space and the church doors, regardless of people's religion, to hold just quite frankly peace circles. It doesn't have to be anything that's too structured, but just maybe someone to guide the conversation. I think just opening the doors for young people just to come and talk about some of the emotional baggage that they may be carrying with them that day or for the last couple of months.
Mm,
I say this all because I grew up as a mute, not on purpose, because I actually never knew how to process all of the trauma that I was going through and everything that was happening in my life. And if you ask my mom and my friends growing up, they would say that I was a one-word person or a sentence person. I didn't really share too much about anything, about anyone or anything. If I held any ill feelings towards you, I wouldn't even let you know. I would just try my best to avoid you. So I say all this to say that if I had opportunities to vent and express myself, then perhaps I wouldn't have been in that situation where my rage and frustration had reached this boiling point.
Several
I think
times
that,
tonight,
and I
you
think that
referenced
that's the
restorative justice.
Say that again, John.
Several times tonight, you have referenced restorative justice.
Yeah.
In the sake of transparency, I'm a heavy restorative justice practitioner. Okay, I teach it, but that's beside the point. However, I would make this offer to you. If you could identify people, a group of young persons in a gang, that the only thing they needed to do was come together to do a healing circle and start the conversation there, I would make myself available
mm.
to facilitate that and bring the resources necessary. And saying this publicly, I need the rabbi to sanction it.
Yeah.
I would even move that we do it at Central, and if we couldn't, or some other local community, but again, I'd make myself available. We'd
That's
find a
amazing.
space. We'd do it in a house of faith.
Mm.
If what you're saying, you think that could start the process.
Yeah, I think that so I'll give an example. I won't say any names, but a young brother that I'm mentoring right now, he's Latino, he's in his early 20s, and he's a member of the MS-13 gang, right? And he's at this crossroads, and he told me quite frankly, he's at this crossroads where he's been involved in the criminal justice system, he's been detained before. So he's at this crossroads where we were just in two different places. I was facing that crossroads while serving out my time in prison, and he's at that crossroads while he's in society. So he's torn between, I want to do this new way of life. I've went through the Justice Ambassadors Youth Council. I've been through all these other leadership programs for young people around the city. I'm inspired. I want to engage and continue to do this work, but I'm bound by my commitment that I swore to with this organization over here. And he wants to leave it alone, quite frankly. And I think that I can't be his only mentor in this space. Like if he had places where he could go, something that functions similar to like an Alcohol Anonymous, where at this time of day you can just go in there and talk about the challenges, whatever you may be dealing with, get that positive reassurance that'll give you the strength to carry it on to the next day without committing a bad act. And I think that those opportunities don't exist for youth. And I think, if we think, if we are intentional, I think that, that's just an example of what can be
Joe,
done.
let me throw another piece to you.
Mhm.
Central Synagogue and other houses of worship are involved in a program called Coming Home. And that's exactly what they do. For men and women who are coming home, they help them transition. Again, let's keep the conversation going, and maybe we can get this young man connected to the resources and involvement in the coming homes of the world. Okay? The real point that I want to make here, the church can make a difference. The church does make a difference. We are active participants, as the rabbi has alluded to. It is theologically backed. That's our commitment. That's our mandate, to keep justice alive and to make the mix where justice and theology cross paths. But I'm not going to preach, Nigel, Jarrell. This is your evening. But
We welcome your remarks, John.
I want you to lead this conversation knowing, and other people who are hearing us, the church is an active participant, and people of faith do make a difference.
Yes.
Yes, and
Rabbi, I'm going to give it back to you.
thanks, John. No, this is, I think, I totally kind of, when we talk about prophecy in religious spaces and we talk about prophetic ministry, we're talking about prophets as people who kind of are able to look beyond where our society is, are able to tell the truth about that society and to then move us somewhere else, to see a new vision, a new order for the way things can be. And you are prophetic, both of you, Jarrell and Nigel, in your work, that you are offering a new path forward, a new path that might not even exist yet, but a way for not just to interrupt violence, but to interrupt incarceration, to offer people new pathways, new ways of being in the world, and you're demonstrating it. And we are so honored to offer you our virtual space, but also we got an amen from Rabbi Angela Buchdahl on our physical space as well, which we can talk about later. But we are so honored to be in this conversation with you, and to open up that theological space in our communal space that we share with EMI New York, to support your prophetic ministry and the ways that you are offering our entire city, our state, and even the country, new ways of being, new ways to think about justice, new questions to ask, new ways of moving forward, of offering pathways in we all know is a very divisive time in our country. And so we're so grateful to you for making those connections, for offering your wisdom and your vision to us tonight. And we are so honored to continue supporting your work in any way we can. And both John and I, as Central and as EMI New York, are just grateful for your partnership and your friendship. So thank you both so much for being with us tonight. Thank you to everyone who joined this conversation. This is just the beginning. I mean, this is probably the middle of where we are, but this is we're still on this path together, and we just look forward to being in this work and doing it together, and supporting you. Well,
Thank you, Rabbi, and the honor was mine. Thank you.
You know, thank you. Thank you for having us. I really appreciated this opportunity. And I think that our work has just begun, as you have already highlighted.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you both so much. May you be blessed to continue in your work, and may we be blessed to strengthen your work and work together. Thank you so much
Rabbi.
for being here tonight, and we look forward to more.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jarrell. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. See you.
Take care, everyone.